Part 1. You will hear a discussion between two flatmates about their concerns regarding another tenant. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now listen and answer questions 1 to 6.
Hey, David. Glad I caught you. Can I have a quick word? It's about our new roommate, Felix. He's not exactly what I was expecting. I was wondering if you also have concerns about some of his habits.
Yeah, Matt. I see what you mean. But let's not be entirely negative. He does have some good qualities. At least he stays silent. He doesn't blast music all night, disturb others, or turn up the volume on his TV, keeping everyone awake.
Sure, he's quiet, but remember our last housemate? He would always greet you, smile, and be polite to everyone. In comparison, this new guy is quite rude. He barely acknowledges me, just mumbles, or ignores me altogether.
I think that's just his personality, just how he is. I don't think he means to be rude, and it shouldn't really bother us. We can just keep to ourselves and live our own lives.
But his guests are hard to ignore when they show up.
I know what you mean, but how often does that really happen? I rarely see them, maybe once or twice every few weeks. If they visited more often, it might be a real issue. But as it is, their visits are too rare to worry about. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I'm not sure, since it's very obvious when they're here because of all the cigarette smoke in the house. It stinks up the place, and we don't allow smoking on the premises.
Well, I've never actually seen them doing it. Maybe they step outside. Perhaps we should have a word with Felix about it. But in one aspect, he's actually a good tenant. And that's the most important thing. Our previous roommate used to be late with rent all the time.
I know what you're going to say. This guy pays instantly. But there's more to being a good tenant than paying rent punctually. You need to turn off electronics, clean your dishes, dress appropriately, be polite, and so on. Basically, you need to comply with the rest of us, and in that respect, Felix is really failing.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
Okay, I suppose you have a point there. Tell you what, Matt, why don't we sit down and talk to Felix about these issues? If we ask him to leave, we'll have to go through the hassle of finding another roommate, who might not even be any better. Let's at least give him a fair chance. Look, I've got some paper here. Let's make a short list of things to discuss with him.
Sure, let's give him one more chance. So write down communication and let's tell him to.
Well, we can't expect someone to change overnight, so why don't we start by having a weekly house meeting? We can just ask him to attend, so we can get to know him better. I'll write join meetings, and we'll go from there.
Fine, but we also need to talk to him about his friends. They can't just do whatever they like, right? Yes, and then, no smoking anywhere, inside or outside.
Instead of being so direct and risking offending him, I'll just write respect rules and explain it verbally. TV off by 10 p.m. No loud noise and no bad behavior, including smoking.
All right, but I still think we should state that last point clearly. You know how much I dislike smoking, so I want it as a separate point. Right, cigarettes. Strictly banned. Make sure to include strictly. We can't be too vague about this. Sometimes we just have to be direct.
Okay, I'll write that down. Strictly banned. All right. And what about cleaning duties? Felix seems a bit too relaxed when it comes to that. Dishes pile up, mugs with leftover tea sit around, and so on.
So right, must improve.
Yeah, again, Matt. He might take that too personally, and it could cause unnecessary conflict. I'd rather phrase it more generally. I'll write, house chores must be done, and I'll make it clear that this applies to everyone, not just him.
All right. As long as he gets the message.
That is the end of Part 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers to Part 1. Part 2. You will hear a speaker explaining essential first aid steps and strategies to prevent injuries in an industrial setting. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 17. Now listen and answer questions 11 to 17.
Good day, everyone. You are all employed in a manufacturing plant, and in such an environment, the likelihood of incidents occurring is always present. In these situations, immediate medical assistance is crucial. So, what exactly is emergency care? It refers to the urgent treatment provided on site when an injury takes place, and it's vital that everyone has at least some basic understanding of the procedures to follow. While some injuries are minor and may not require additional medical attention beyond what the responder provides, you can never be entirely certain. Therefore, the following process must always be carried out. This can be summed up by the Dr. C, A, B, D, E. In other words, C, A, B, D, and E. The letter C stands for caution, which is the primary concern. When an accident happens, the first thing to check is whether the surroundings are secure, ensuring, for example, that no further objects are at risk of falling, or that no additional hazards could cause further injuries. If the individual providing aid also gets harmed, the situation worsens. The next letter, A, represents alertness. Once you've ensured there is no immediate threat, you need to evaluate the individual's level of consciousness. Once it is clear that no further risks are present and emergency services have been contacted, your focus should shift to providing immediate assistance. This brings us to B, which stands for breathing passage. For survival, all individuals must have a clear airway to facilitate respiration. If a person is conscious, they will instinctively maintain an open airway. However, if they are unconscious, this function may be compromised. The brain's ability to control bodily processes becomes impaired, and in severe cases, this can lead to fatal consequences. That's why the injured individual is usually placed in the restoration stance, positioned sideways, with the head tilted backward to ensure there are no obstructions in the airway. If any blockage is detected, it can often be cleared by patting the back or applying pressure to the chest to help expel it. With the airway secured, you should then verify D, which stands for dehydration. If the individual is not showing signs of adequate circulation, the responder may need to perform what is formally called pulmonary resuscitation, more commonly known as PR. This procedure involves providing artificial breaths through mouth-to-mouth contact, accompanied by rhythmic chest compressions to stimulate the heart. This technique ensures that oxygen continues to circulate throughout the body, sustaining the individual until trained medical personnel, such as paramedics, professional caregivers, or emergency responders, arrive on site.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 18 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 18 to 20.
Of course, having knowledge of urgent first aid procedures is highly beneficial, but the ideal scenario is to prevent injuries from occurring in the first place. This requires attentiveness to safety measures. However, simply telling employees to stay cautious is often ineffective. A better approach is to assign a designated supervisor whose responsibility is to promote awareness and enforce safety protocols. Conducting routine inspections should be a key part of their role, ensuring, for example, that emergency kits are adequately stocked. Another approach is placing reminder boards around the workspace, but studies have indicated that these often go unnoticed, blending into the environment without making a real impact. A more effective method is fostering a mindset of thoughtful action, encouraging individuals to pause and assess risks before engaging in any task that could result in injury. Cultivating this approach is one of the responsibilities of the safety coordinator. Additional strategies include periodic refresher courses on first aid techniques and implementing an incident-free recognition program, where workers are acknowledged for maintaining a safe work environment. While these initiatives have seen some success, nothing proves more effective than regular team discussions, perhaps held every 4 weeks, where safety-related matters are openly addressed and any ongoing concerns are thoroughly examined.
That is the end of Part 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers to Part 2. Part 3. You will hear 2 students discussing ways to reduce waste on their college campus. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen and answer questions 21 to 25.
Hey, Emily. As you know, we need to figure out the most effective ways this college can minimize its waste production. You assessed the northern section, while I focused on the southern facilities. Did you also manage to conduct all the interviews?
Yes, I spoke with all the faculty members, and they shared some valuable insights. I also interviewed several students, but honestly, they didn't have much to contribute. It was the janitors who revealed the most relevant facts.
That doesn't surprise me at all. They're the ones who collect the trash daily, so they see exactly what's being thrown away. On the other hand, employees just discard things without giving it much thought. What was the most frequently disposed item?
Well, that depended on the location. In the dining hall area, it was mainly disposable trays and beverage containers. Hardly anyone seemed to bother with recycling. But when looking at the institution as a whole, discarded documents made up the bulk of the waste, far more than plastic or other materials.
Do people actually care about this issue?
Well, some claim they do. I surveyed about 35% of the individuals in the dining section, and the responses varied. Among all the people I questioned, more than half, around 60%, admitted that they weren't particularly concerned. The remaining 40% appeared more worried about it.
Right, but are they taking any action?
Interestingly, quite a notable portion actually do, even if their concern is minimal. They engage in small efforts. For example, about 15% bring their own mugs when they buy drinks, and at least 30% make use of the recycling stations. So overall, it's a nearly even divide between those who take action and those who don't.
So why are so many still doing nothing, even when it's something they should be more aware of?
I believe most people do care, and a good number are willing to contribute. Of course, some people are just indifferent, but I think that's a smaller portion. If clearer guidelines were in place, or if there were stricter rules, or even if awareness campaigns were more effective, I believe a much higher percentage of people would actively participate in reducing waste.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
Well, that gives us a reason to be hopeful, at least. So it's obvious that excessive paper usage is a major problem at this institution. I've come up with one practical idea that might help limit this, particularly the waste caused by unnecessary printing.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, to start with, we need to verify that everyone, including employees, follows a strict policy of printing on both sides of the sheet. We simply can't allow single-sided printing anymore. It's an unnecessary waste.
I completely agree. That's just more forest being cut down.
But when people print, there are often mistakes like drafts, incorrect formatting, or even blank sheets that get discarded. These should be placed in a designated bin for reusing the blank side for future printing.
But in reality, most people don't bother with that. Even if a document isn't important, they'd rather grab a fresh sheet instead of reusing an old one.
Yeah, I get that, which is why we need to make it as visible and convenient as possible. The bin for reusable paper should be placed prominently with a clear label saying, "Use this first."
I still don't think they'll do it.
I get what you mean. That's why, once a day, maybe in the morning, you take some of the paper from the bin and preload it into the printer's alternative tray, so it's easily accessible.
That does make it more convenient, but I'm still doubtful that people will actually use it.
That's why you provide every employee an individual login or access code, allowing them to select this tray when printing. Each time they use recycled sheets, it's tracked under their profile.
I don't want to sound pessimistic, but what's their motivation for using that option?
Because whoever uses the most recycled sheets each month gets a small reward, maybe a gift card, a meal voucher, or something similar.
Ah, I see. Now that's an idea that might actually encourage them. Let's test it out in the office and see how it goes.
That is the end of Part 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers to Part 3. Part 4. You will hear a lecturer discussing techniques for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 33. Now listen and answer questions 31 to 33.
We are all familiar with the impact of greenhouse gases on climate change. One of the primary contributors is carbon emissions, especially carbon dioxide, also referred to as CO2. This gas is produced when fossil fuels like natural gas and petroleum are burned, and eliminating or even significantly reducing these emissions is nearly impossible. Our demand for electricity and industrial power is simply too high. A more viable alternative would be to capture carbon dioxide at the source, such as directly from factory exhausts, and stop it from entering the air. However, to achieve this, the gas must be stored in a way that ensures it never re-enters the atmosphere. For this reason, many experts argue that rather than keeping carbon dioxide in its gaseous state, it should be transformed into a solid by reacting it with elements such as silicon or iron. This chemical process creates a stable, rock-like compound that can be safely disposed of. In nature, this occurs naturally over thousands of years, and is one reason behind the formation of certain rock deposits, such as basalt. However, the major challenge is speed. Even when scientists attempt to accelerate the reaction by using high-pressure chambers or chemical treatments, the process remains inefficient and impractical for large-scale use. Another proposed solution involves injecting the gas deep into the ocean, where it would combine with substances in seawater to produce a weak acid called bicarbonate. However, this method has been largely abandoned. While it may successfully remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the increased acidity in ocean water could have devastating consequences for marine life and disrupt intricate food webs, many of which directly or indirectly support human survival. No government is willing to take such a massive ecological risk.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 34 to 40. Now listen and answer questions 34 to 40.
With few viable alternatives, the most widely debated approach for carbon disposal is storing the gas beneath the Earth's surface, a method called carbon trapping. In this process, CO2 would be injected into deep underground reservoirs, such as depleted gas fields or abandoned mining shafts. However, this technique presents three major concerns: the possibility of leaks, the high financial costs, and finally, the unproven effectiveness. The first concern is leakage. Although the gas would be buried under layers of rock, the immense pressure in these chambers would convert it into a fluid, allowing it to move through small fractures underground. Over time, these movements could result in gas escaping back to the surface. Since carbon dioxide is denser than air, its release in large amounts could displace oxygen, potentially causing suffocation. Historical records already show that naturally occurring CO2 leaks from volcanic sources have caused deadly incidents. The second issue is cost. Setting up and maintaining underground storage sites is incredibly expensive. The infrastructure required, particularly the pipelines that transport the gas, demands substantial investment. If this method were widely adopted, for example, in industries reliant on coal-fired plants, the additional cost would ultimately fall on consumers. The result: energy bills could increase by double, making it an unpopular solution for the general public. Most people are unwilling to pay such a high price to achieve a relatively small reduction in global emissions. Finally, the biggest question remains: does carbon trapping truly help fight climate change? The reality is that the energy required to collect, transport, and inject the gas underground would consume nearly 20% of a power station's energy output. This means that coal plants would need to burn significantly more fuel just to compensate for the sequestration process. And given that coal releases not just CO2, but also other harmful substances like nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, the overall environmental benefits would be minimal. Despite these concerns, research is ongoing. Several experimental projects, mostly conducted at petroleum drilling sites, are closely monitored to assess long-term feasibility. These studies are small in scale but provide valuable insights into the potential effectiveness of underground carbon storage. For now, scientists remain divided on whether this approach will ever become a practical solution for reducing atmospheric carbon levels.
That is the end of Part 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers to Part 4.